The MG42 is remembered as one of the most feared weapons of World War II. Introduced by Nazi Germany in 1942, its sound became a symbol of danger across Europe. But fear does not always mean trust. While enemy soldiers dreaded its fire, the men who carried it faced a very different reality. This is not the story of what the MG42 could do. This is the story of how it felt to depend on it. World War II began in 1939, and from the very start, machine guns played a central role in modern combat. By the early years of the war, Germany was already searching for a more flexible, faster, and cheaper replacement for its older machine guns. This effort led to the introduction of the MG42 in 1942, at a time when the war had expanded across multiple fronts. From a technical perspective, the MG42 seemed revolutionary. Its extremely high rate of fire gave it a battlefield presence unlike most weapons that came before it. To soldiers facing it, the MG42 did not sound like individual shots but like a continuous roar, fast, mechanical, and relentless. During battles on the Eastern Front after 1941 and later in Western Europe from 1944, Allied troops repeatedly described German machine gun fire as overwhelming. Over time, this battlefield fear evolved into reputation. And reputation soon turned into legend. After the war ended in 1945, the MG42's image continued to grow. Military analysts studied it. Weapons designers examined it. Later machine guns developed in the late 1940s and 1950s clearly reflected its influence. In post-war military literature, the MG42 was often described as being ahead of its time. It was portrayed as a symbol of German engineering efficiency, a weapon that perfectly matched the demands of modern warfare. But these post-war interpretations often relied on hindsight. They focused on design brilliance, not daily use. They highlighted battlefield impact, not soldier experience. They compared the MG42 to older weapons, without fully addressing the conditions under which it was actually carried and fired between 1942 and 1945. A battlefield is not a testing ground. German soldiers using the MG42 did so while advancing, retreating, or holding ground under constant pressure. They operated in snow, mud, rain, and rubble. They carried heavy equipment over long distances, often with limited rest. And they were expected to keep their machine gun operational no matter the conditions. The popular image of the MG42 usually ignores this reality. Most historical footage and illustrations show the MG42 in controlled or ideal situations, set up in defensive positions, supported by a crew with clear lines of fire. But many engagements during the later years of the war, especially after 1943, were chaotic and fast-moving. As Germany shifted increasingly into defensive warfare, machine gun teams were often repositioned quickly, sometimes without sufficient preparation. Under those conditions, a weapon's strengths could also become its weaknesses. Yet these experiences rarely shaped the MG42's public image. During the war, German propaganda highlighted technological strength and battlefield dominance. After the war, historical narratives focused on innovation and influence. In both cases, the everyday frustrations of soldiers were pushed aside. This is how myths are formed. The MG42 became known not just as a weapon, but as an idea, a symbol of unstoppable firepower. Once that symbol took hold, questioning it felt unnecessary. Or in some cases, uncomfortable. It is important to be clear, recognizing limitations does not mean denying effectiveness. Between 1942 and 1945, the MG42 was deadly. It shaped infantry tactics and left a lasting mark on military history. But a weapon can be deadly and demanding at the same time. The men who carried the MG42 were not thinking about post-war influence or future designs. They were thinking about weight, control, timing, and survival. They were thinking about how a weapon behaved when everything around them was falling apart. Those thoughts rarely appeared in official reports. They appeared instead in private reflections, letters home, quiet conversations, and later recollections written after the war had ended. These voices complicate the legend. And that is exactly why they matter. To understand the MG42 fully, we must look beyond its reputation and examine the gap between myth and lived experience, between how the weapon is remembered today and how it was actually carried between 1942 and 1945. Because history becomes clearer when we listen not only to what weapons did, but to what soldiers endured while using them. When the MG42 entered service in 1942, German soldiers were introduced to it through structured training and carefully designed doctrine. On paper, the weapon represented efficiency. It was lighter than some older machine guns, faster to deploy, and capable of delivering overwhelming firepower. During training exercises in 1942 and 1943, MG42 crews learned to operate the weapon in controlled conditions. They practiced barrel changes. They memorized firing drills. They were taught how the weapon was supposed to behave. But training does not replicate combat. On the battlefield, soldiers did not fight under ideal circumstances. They fought while tired, hungry, and under constant threat. They moved through forests, fields, ruined cities, and frozen terrain. And in these conditions, the gap between expectation and reality began to appear. Many MG42 crews quickly realized that the weapon demanded constant attention. Its high rate of fire, often praised in manuals, required discipline to control. Short bursts were essential. Mistakes were costly. In real combat, especially during intense engagements after 1943, stress made precision difficult. A gunner who fired too long risked overheating. A crew that hesitated risked exposure. Every action had consequences. Weight was another issue rarely emphasized in training. While the MG42 itself was designed to be efficient, it was never carried alone. Ammunition belts, spare barrels, tools, and personal gear added up quickly. On long marches or rapid retreats during 1944 and 1945, this burden became exhausting. Soldiers often had to reposition quickly. What looked manageable on a firing range became punishing after hours of movement. Fatigue affected judgment, reaction time, and coordination between crew members. The MG42 also required teamwork. Unlike simpler rifles, it depended on cooperation between gunner, assistant, and ammunition carrier. When one man was wounded or separated, the entire system suffered. By the later years of the war, especially after 1944, German units increasingly operated under pressure. Supplies were inconsistent. Replacements were less experienced. Training time was shortened. Under these conditions, the MG42's demands became even more noticeable. A weapon that required precision, discipline, and coordination could feel unforgiving in chaotic situations. Soldiers had to remain calm while everything around them collapsed. This was easier said than done. It is important to understand that these frustrations did not mean soldiers rejected the MG42 outright. Many respected its power. Many understood its tactical value. But respect does not erase difficulty. In defensive battles on the Western Front in 1944, MG42 teams were often expected to hold positions against superior numbers. The weapon became the backbone of German infantry defense. That responsibility added pressure. Every malfunction, delay, or mistake felt amplified. When a weapon is central to survival, its flaws feel personal. Training manuals did not prepare soldiers for the emotional weight of that responsibility. They did not explain how fear affects hands, breathing, and decision-making. They did not account for exhaustion after days without rest. These realities shaped how soldiers experienced the MG42. Not as a legend, but as a tool they depended on daily. The difference between expectation and reality grew wider as the war progressed. What had once seemed like technological confidence slowly turned into cautious respect and sometimes quiet frustration. By 1945, Germany's situation had deteriorated significantly. Many MG42 crews were young, undertrained, or fighting in desperate conditions. The weapon remained powerful, but the circumstances had changed. Looking back, this contrast helps explain why the MG42's legend feels incomplete. Post-war analysis often focuses on design and performance. But soldier experience reveals something more complex. The MG42 was not just a weapon to be admired. It was a responsibility. One that demanded constant focus in a world where focus was hard to maintain. Understanding this gap between expectation and reality brings us closer to the truth. Not the truth of myths or manuals, but the truth of the battlefield. When the MG42 was introduced in 1942, its most famous feature was also its most demanding one: its extremely high rate of fire. On paper, this was an advantage. A machine gun that could dominate an area in seconds fit perfectly into German infantry doctrine. But on the battlefield, speed came with consequences. From the very beginning, MG42 crews were taught to respect the weapon's heat. Training emphasized short bursts and regular barrel changes. In controlled environments during 1942 and early 1943, this system worked. Combat was different. Under real battlefield pressure, controlling fire was far more difficult. Fear, adrenaline, and chaos pushed soldiers to fire longer than intended. When attacks intensified, restraint became a challenge. The MG42 heated rapidly. This was not a flaw unique to the weapon, it was a reality of its design and performance. High firepower generated high heat. And heat introduced risk. In theory, the solution was simple. Change the barrel. In practice, barrel changes during combat were anything but simple. MG42 crews carried spare barrels and protective gloves. They trained to replace overheated barrels quickly. But during intense engagements, especially after 1943, conditions were rarely ideal. Smoke reduced visibility. Enemy fire forced crews to stay low. Communication between team members became strained. A delayed barrel change could reduce effectiveness. A rushed one could cause mistakes. By 1944, as fighting intensified on both the eastern and western fronts, MG42 teams were often under constant pressure. In defensive battles, the machine gun was expected to fire repeatedly to hold ground. This increased the risk of overheating. Barrel changes required exposure. Even a few seconds above cover could be dangerous. Gunners had to balance safety with necessity. These moments created tension. The MG42's power meant it was relied upon heavily. That reliance increased stress. The weapon became both a shield and a burden. For many soldiers, the fear was not just of the enemy. It was a failure at the wrong moment. An overheated barrel could slow fire. A poorly handled change could cause burns or delays. Under fire, small mistakes felt enormous. As the war progressed toward 1945, these pressures intensified. German units increasingly faced shortages, fatigue, and constant movement. Machine gun crews were often exhausted before combat even began. In these conditions, discipline became harder to maintain. The MG42 demanded calm hands and clear thinking. But battlefield reality often provided neither. It is important to note that Allied forces also recognized these limitations. Captured MG42s were studied not just for their firepower, but for their handling requirements. Post-war analysis in the late 1940s acknowledged both strengths and demands. Yet during the war itself, German soldiers had to learn these lessons the hard way. Manuals could not teach how fear affects timing. Training could not replicate the pressure of holding a position while under sustained attack. No instruction prepared soldiers for the mental strain of knowing that a moment of hesitation could cost lives. This created a unique relationship between MG42 crews and their weapon. They respected it. They depended on it. But they also feared its demands. Unlike a rifle, the MG42 did not forgive carelessness. It required constant awareness. Every burst had to be measured. Every barrel change had to be judged. Under ideal conditions, this system worked well. Under battlefield pressure, it tested limits. By late 1944 and early 1945, many MG42 crews were operating in defensive or retreating situations. Positions were temporary. Resupply was uncertain. Fatigue was constant. In such circumstances, the MG42's intense firepower became a double-edged sword. It could dominate a moment, but it demanded a price. This is why soldier accounts often reflect a complicated view. Not rejection, not blind praise, but a quiet understanding of what it took to make the weapon work when it mattered most. The MG42 was deadly, yes, but it asked more of its operators than its legend suggests. And under pressure, even the most powerful weapon could feel unforgiving. Understanding this tension helps explain why the MG42 story is not just about engineering. It is about endurance, discipline, and the human cost of sustained fire. The MG42's power depended on more than just its design. It depended on ammunition. And ammunition depended on logistics. When the MG42 entered service in 1942, German infantry doctrine assumed steady supply lines. Machine gun teams were expected to have continuous access to belts, spare parts, and replacement barrels. In the early years of the war, especially during large-scale offensives, this assumption often held true. But war is not static. As the conflict expanded after 1943, Germany's logistical situation became increasingly strained. Multiple fronts demanded resources at the same time. Transportation networks were damaged. Production faced disruption. Under these conditions, the MG42's appetite for ammunition became more noticeable. The weapon's high rate of fire, so effective tactically, consumed belts quickly. In short, intense engagements, this was acceptable. But during prolonged fighting, resupply became a constant concern. Machine gun crews had to think not only about firing effectively, but about conserving ammunition. This created tension between doctrine and reality. Hold the line, but do not empty the belts too quickly. Suppress the enemy, but think about what comes next. These decisions were not made in calm environments. They were made under pressure. By 1944, especially on the Western Front, German units increasingly found themselves on the defensive. Retreats became common. Positions were abandoned and reoccupied repeatedly. In such situations, ammunition could be lost, damaged, or left behind. MG42 crews often carried as much as they could physically manage. Belts were heavy. Boxes added weight. Every additional round increased fatigue. During rapid movement, soldiers had to make choices. Carry more ammunition or move faster. Protect supplies or reach cover. These trade-offs shaped daily experience. Logistical strain also affected coordination. A machine gun without ammunition was little more than dead weight. Crews depended on riflemen and support troops to help carry belts forward. When units were fragmented or under strength, this system broke down. By late 1944 and early 1945, many German formations faced shortages across the board. Fuel, food, and ammunition were all limited. Machine gun teams were not immune to this reality. Under these conditions, the MG42's role became heavier psychologically. When a weapon is central to defense, every empty belt feels critical. Every delay feels dangerous. Soldiers became more cautious. Fire discipline became a survival skill, not just a training concept. But caution had its own risks. Holding fire too long could invite attack. Firing too freely could leave a position vulnerable later. These pressures did not appear in post-war technical evaluations. They existed only in the moment, in the decisions made by tired men under threat. Late-war conditions amplified every weakness. Younger, less experienced soldiers were often assigned to MG42 crews. Training was shortened. Mistakes were more likely. At the same time, Allied forces increased pressure. Air superiority disrupted movement. Artillery fire limited static defense. Resupply routes became dangerous. In this environment, the MG42 remained powerful, but power alone was not enough. The weapon demanded planning, coordination, and steady nerves, resources that were increasingly scarce by 1945. This reality explains why many soldiers remembered the MG42 with mixed feelings. It could dominate a battlefield moment. but it tied them closely to supply chains that were no longer reliable. The machine gun became a symbol of dependence, not just on engineering but on logistics that could fail at any moment. After the war ended in 1945, historical narratives often separated weapons from the systems that supported them. The MG42 was analyzed as an object. Its role within collapsing supply networks was discussed far less. But for the men who carried it, these things were inseparable. A weapon is only as effective as the ammunition behind it. And by the final years of the war, that foundation was increasingly unstable. Understanding this logistical strain adds another layer to the MG42 story. It was not simply a question of firepower. It was a question of sustainability. And as Germany's ability to sustain the war declined, even its most feared weapons were pulled into that decline. The MG42 did not fail because it lacked power. It struggled because the system around it was breaking. And in war, no weapon stands alone. During World War II, public narratives and private experiences rarely matched. This gap became especially clear when the war ended in 1945 and soldiers began to reflect on what they had lived through. While official reports and propaganda emphasized strength and success, private writings told quieter stories. German soldiers were encouraged to speak confidently about their weapons during the war. Public criticism was discouraged. Morale mattered. Doubt was something to be kept personal. As a result, many honest reactions to the MG42 did not appear in official documents written between 1942 and 1945. They appeared elsewhere in letters home, in personal notebooks, and later, in memoirs written after the fighting had stopped. These sources reveal a more nuanced relationship between soldiers and their machine gun. In private, many soldiers expressed respect for the MG42's power. They understood its importance. They relied on it for survival. But respect did not eliminate frustration. Personal writings often focused on the daily challenges rather than battlefield glory. The weight of equipment, the pressure of constant readiness, the anxiety of managing fire under stress. These were not dramatic complaints. They were practical ones. Soldiers wrote about exhaustion, about carrying ammunition for hours, about the tension of knowing that mistakes could be costly. These reflections became more frequent as the war dragged on, especially after 1943, when conditions worsened. By 1944, Germany's situation had changed dramatically. Retreats replaced advances. Supplies were inconsistent. Units were under strength. In this environment, private frustrations deepened. The MG42 was no longer just a weapon of offense. It was often a last line of defense. This made its demands feel heavier. Post-war memoirs written in the late 1940s and 1950s provide further insight. With censorship gone and distance from the battlefield, veterans could speak more openly. These reflections rarely dismissed the MG42 outright. Instead, they described it as demanding, exhausting, and unforgiving under pressure. Many veterans emphasized that the legend of the MG42 grew louder after the war than during it. During combat, they were too focused on survival to think about reputation. Only later did they realize how simplified the public image had become. This contrast is important. It shows how history can drift away from lived experience. When stories are retold, complexity is often lost. Weapons become symbols rather than tools. Diaries and letters resist that simplification. They remind us that behind every weapon is a human being managing fear, fatigue, and responsibility. They show that frustration does not equal failure, it reflects realism. These private voices also help explain why the MG42 inspired mixed emotions. It offered protection but demanded constant attention. It delivered power but consumed energy. Soldiers did not view it through the lens of future influence or technical admiration. They viewed it through the lens of survival. By 1945, many German soldiers were exhausted physically and emotionally. The MG42 remained effective, but its demands were felt more sharply than ever. Looking back, these private reflections challenge the clean narrative of superiority. They do not deny effectiveness. They add context. Post-war historians gradually began to incorporate these perspectives. But popular culture often lagged behind, continuing to celebrate the MG42 primarily as a symbol of fear. This imbalance shaped how generations understood the weapon. Only by revisiting personal accounts can we begin to correct it. These accounts do not weaken history. They strengthen it. They remind us that warfare is not experienced through blueprints or statistics. It is experienced through tired hands, strained nerves, and difficult decisions. The MG42's story, when told through private voices, becomes more human. Less myth, more reality. And that reality matters. Because when we listen to what soldiers wrote in moments of honesty, we gain a clearer understanding of the past. Not as it was advertised, but as it was lived. By the time World War II ended in 1945, the MG42 had already secured its place in history. It was remembered as fast, powerful, and intimidating. For many, it symbolized the terrifying efficiency of German infantry firepower. But legends are rarely built from complete stories. They are built from fragments, fear, impact, and hindsight. When historians, engineers, and militaries studied the MG42 after the war, especially during the late 1940s and 1950s, they focused on its influence. Its design inspired future machine guns. Its concept reshaped infantry tactics. From a technical perspective, this admiration was understandable. Yet technology alone does not tell us how a weapon is experienced. The MG42 was not carried by engineers or historians. It was carried by soldiers, often tired, often under pressure, and often facing impossible decisions. Between 1942 and 1945, those soldiers learned that the MG42 was not just a tool of power. It was a responsibility. A responsibility to control fire, to manage heat, to conserve ammunition, to work as a team under stress. When everything worked, the MG42 could dominate a battlefield moment. When conditions failed through fatigue, supply shortages, or chaos, its demands became heavier. This duality is at the heart of the MG42's real story. It explains why the weapon inspired fear in enemies and mixed emotions in those who used it. It explains why public reputation and private experience often diverged. The legend of the MG42 grew louder after the war because it was easier to remember the sound than the strain. Easier to admire the effect than to understand the effort. But soldier experience reminds us of an essential truth. No weapon operates in isolation. It operates within systems, logistics, training, morale, and human limits. When those systems weaken, even the most advanced designs are tested. By 1944 and 1945, Germany's military system was under immense strain. The MG42 did not suddenly lose its power. The world around it changed. And in that changing world, the weapon's strengths and weaknesses became inseparable. This is why reducing the MG42 to a simple symbol of superiority misses the point. It was effective, but it was also demanding. It protected lives and exhausted the men who depended on it. Understanding this balance does not diminish history. It makes it more honest. When we look back at World War II, it is tempting to focus on machines, tanks, planes, weapons. They are tangible. They are dramatic. But war is ultimately a human experience. The MG42's story becomes more meaningful when we see it through the eyes of those who carried it. Not as a myth. Not as a monster, but as a powerful tool that required endurance, discipline, and resilience. This perspective does not rewrite history. It completes it. Because legends tell us what weapons did. But soldier experiences tell us what war demanded. And when we listen to those experiences, we gain a clearer understanding of the past. Not as a collection of famous machines, but as a series of human struggles shaped by them. The MG42 remains one of the most recognizable weapons of World War II. But its true story lives not just in museums or manuals. It lives in the quiet space between fear and responsibility, where soldiers carried its weight, and history carried the legend.